Hey guys, Reed here with Big Strong Book, and this video is going to be a little bit of an introduction to a project, a series, whatever you want to call it, that will last the next couple of weeks with about one video a day. So I was doing some thinking recently, and I realized that I haven't done any poetry discussions on this channel. And besides, it would lend itself pretty well to just consistent daily content. So I thought I would just dive into that whole dark, deep world. And my knowledge of poetry is not what it should be. I've got a handful of poetry collections, but haven't really dedicated time because, you know, I'm a quick reader, and that lends itself pretty well to reading a lot of short stories, novels in a short amount of time, but not so for poetry. Poetry demands time and attention, as it should. Good poetry in particular. Good poetry, you can read it 100, 200 times and still get something out of it, still understand it. Not to say that poetry should be inaccessible, but you get what I mean. And you know, I wanted to do it in a way where we could have a little series without, you know, spending a whole video talking about just one short poem, but kind of dedicating itself to perhaps starting, at least for now, more of the epics in world poetry. We're going to start with the Americans. I have the complete poems of 3 American poets: Hart Crane, Emily Dickinson, and Walt Whitman. Probably the ultimate 3 masters. If you maybe want to throw in Longfellow, you know, William Carlos Williams is a great one. I would say Melville too. But yeah, those are the big ones that come to mind. And Hart Crane is the one I'm the least familiar with. So I have his complete poems here with the introduction by Harold Bloom. And that's kind of how I first heard of Hart Crane, was just in listening to and viewing interviews with Harold Bloom, as well as some of his writings, where he talks about as almost a young boy, being entranced by Hart Crane, and I had never heard of Hart Crane. And so I guess this video will serve initially as an introduction quick into what this series will be, as if you haven't guessed from the title, as well as just a brief overview of what I have read about Hart Crane's life and just why I'm interested in doing this. So this series will be dedicated to Hart Crane's epic poem, The Bridge. I believe he published this in 1930, so a few years before his untimely death, suicide. We're not exactly sure what his intentions were, if there were direct intentions behind his jumping off of a cruise ship. So the bridge, Hart Crane wrote as he said it, as kind of a more optimistic, uplifting, exciting ode to America, in a counterpoint to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which of course dominated the poetry scene of the 1920s. T.S. Eliot, of course, the American, later British author. And I'm not that familiar with The Wasteland either. I've read bits and pieces of it. And Hart Crane lived a very volatile life. I was reading that his father was one of the inventors behind the Lifesavers candy. Random fact of the day. And he he dropped out of high school and moved to New York, was working various like copywriting jobs. Hart Crane was also gay, or at least he may have been bisexual, but almost all of his relationships were with men, and he let that flow through his work. You know, you get a lot of artists out there who their sexuality is they choose to kind of, you know, not compartmentalize, but to separate the two. Hart Crane, I think, wrote that he didn't want to do that. He wanted to kind of explore homosexuality in full throughout his poetry, which I'm daring, certainly for the time, the 19 teens and the 20s and then into the 30s. And he was also an alcoholic. He drank a lot. We don't really have, of course, because of when he died, and he died in 1932. So we've never had an interview with him. I don't think there are any audio recordings of him out there. But in the 70s and in the 80s, they did a lot of filmed interviews with his friends and colleagues who were able to remember him and tell stories. And yeah, just a very volatile. It strikes me as a very sensitive to criticism. When he published a poetry collection called, I think, White Buildings, and it failed critically, commercially, and it made him very, not inconsolable, but just it didn't sit well with him. And then he went to Mexico, I think, on a Guggenheim Fellowship with the wife of Malcolm Cowley, who wrote the novel Under the Volcano. And they, Crane and Cowley, Cowley's wife, had an affair with each other. And then as they were coming back to America from Mexico on this cruise ship or this ocean liner, he, and then this is what I read from his bio, he apparently made advances towards a male crew member on the ship. He was beaten for it by others. And he had already been drinking heavily during the time. And then one day he just kind of jumped overboard and said, "Bye, everybody." And his body was never recovered. So still uncertainty if it was a drunken action, if it was intent was suicide, but he was drunk anyway. He might not have even really been drunk when he died. So we don't know. And yeah, he left us probably far too short. It would have been interesting to see where his career would have progressed had he not died at the time he did. But anyway, so the series will kind of go into the bridge. We'll start with the 2 Brooklyn Bridge today, and then kind of every day here on out. In addition to the book reviews on this channel, you'll see just videos going into the sections. I'll read aloud from the section, and then we'll just kind of dive into it, and I'll give my impressions. And I know I won't get at everything. Hart Crane is a very difficult poet, and my familiarity with poetry as a whole is very, very amateur, to say the least. So, but we'll have fun doing it. So, yeah, if you have a copy of the complete poems of Hart Crane or a copy of The Bridge, feel free to follow along. And yeah, looking forward to seeing where this goes.